Hi, my name is Bethany Reinhart, and I am a science and medical reporter with the Columbia Chronicle. And I'm currently working on taking apart a study that was done by Valorie Salimpoor and her team at McGill University in Montreal. And they did a study that helps explain why music has persisted since the beginning of time, and that dopamine is actually released in your brain when you listen to what they consider to be intensely pleasurable music. Now, it's been expected for years that music is something that we rely on often because it causes a pleasurable sensation, but up until now, scientists were never really able to prove that this was the case and why. So what Valorie and her team did was they recruited a group of people who brought in music that they considered intensely pleasurable. Now, when I say intensely pleasurable, that's measured by something called the chills, which is actually a physiological change that happens in your body, and it's a scientific marker for when you reach a peak emotional feeling. So people will often experience chills when they listen to a commercial that makes them very emotional, or if there's a score from a movie that the score is an incredibly emotional score leading up to an emotional point in a movie. So it's a baseline that's used in the scientific community. So these participants brought in the music and listened to it over the course of 2 days, and what Salimpoor and her team found was quite astonishing. The finding that they expected was that, in fact, dopamine is released in your brain when you're listening to intensely pleasurable music and you reach that peak emotional sensation or the chills. That was pretty much what they expected. However, at that point, they found that dopamine was released in a certain area of your brain called the nucleus accumbens. Now, dopamine works, there's quite a wide misconception about dopamine. Dopamine is considered by many people to be a feel-good chemical in your brain, and where it is somewhat a feel-good chemical, it is actually not the main feel-good chemical in your brain. Instead, what it is it's a chemical that reinforces behavior. So when you do something that your body likes, your brain releases dopamine, and that kind of helps stamp in that behavior, which is actually what leads to addictive behavior. So for example, this area of the brain, the nucleus accumbens, is affected when people do things like when they feel that rush from doing cocaine, or smoking a cigarette and taking nicotine, or even eating a very pleasurable meal. However, so that's how it kind of plays a bit on the addiction system. Now, the more interesting find in Salimpoor's study was that dopamine was actually released in the brain in a totally separate area of the brain prior to participants feeling that peak emotional sensation. It was just prior to that, and that actually shows that we as human beings are somewhat craving music. So we begin to release dopamine in a separate area of our brain called the caudate, and that is showing that music, for whatever reason, has been ingrained into our brain as something we anticipate, and we want to get that feeling and to continue on to the peak emotional arousal. So the findings really suggest that there's a reason why music has been around for so long. Now, we obviously know music has been around forever, for all of recorded history and every culture around the globe, but there was never really a good example of why. It's not something that is needed for advancing the species. It's not a survival mechanism like eating or sex. It's a more aesthetic stimulus. So these studies begin to show that there's an actual reason why we are somewhat addicted to music. And the finding that it was released in the caudate was quite interesting, because that is a part of your brain that's in the prefrontal cortex of your brain, and that is a part that is very uniquely adapted to humans, meaning that it's a Labrador region that is what separates us from animals. So the findings really suggest that there's a lot more to learn about music and how these interactions play within the brain, but it's beginning to show that our brains have developed to a level where we can appreciate and even need an aesthetic stimuli to continue our species.